2 years after losing everything in a divorce. I bought a farm nobody wanted, a place the bank couldn't sell, a place the neighbors said was cursed with failure. And the only thing working on that entire property was a rusted tractor that hadn't run in years. Entry 1. May 4th, 2023. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 44 years old, and as of today, I officially own 70 acres of land outside the small town of Cedar Ridge, land that people here call the Old Grayson Place, which is their polite way of saying the farm that died slowly over the last decade. But my story didn't start today. It started 2 years ago when my marriage ended after 21 years. The divorce wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches or slammed doors, just a quiet collapse of something that had already been broken for years. When the paperwork was finished, the house was sold, the bank accounts divided, and I walked away with $41,000 and a strange feeling that I had been erased from my own life. Entry 2. May 6th. For months after the divorce, I drifted. Cheap motel rooms, short-term rentals, long drives with no destination. People kept asking me what I planned to do next, and I never had an answer. My sister Megan suggested I move closer to the city and start fresh, maybe find another office job like the accounting work I had done for most of my adult life. But every time I imagined sitting under fluorescent lights in another cubicle, something inside me shut down. I didn't want to rebuild the life I lost. I wanted something different, even if I didn't know what that meant yet. Entry 3. May 9th. I found the farm by accident while scrolling through foreclosure listings late one night. Most of the properties were small houses or empty lots, but one listing caught my attention immediately. 70 acres, farmhouse, barn, equipment shed, bank-owned. Minimum bid $26,000. That price alone made me suspicious, because land doesn't sell that cheap unless something is very wrong with it. The photos explained why. The house roof sagged like it had been punched in by time. The barn leaned sideways, its doors half rotted and hanging loose. The fields were covered in weeds so tall they swallowed the old fencing. But when I looked past the damage, I saw something else. Open land, wide sky, space. Entry 4. May 12th. I drove out to Cedar Ridge to see the property in person and convinced Megan to come along because she has always been the practical one in the family. The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through hills and pine forests until the paved roads turned into gravel. When we finally pulled up to the rusted gate, Megan just stared at the place in disbelief. "Dan," she said slowly, "this looks like a horror movie setting." She wasn't wrong. The farmhouse had broken windows. The porch railing had collapsed on one side, and the barn looked like a strong wind might finish the job of knocking it over. But what caught my attention was the equipment shed. Inside, buried under dust and bird feathers, sat an old red tractor. The bank agent who met us there brushed some dirt off the hood and said it was a 1961 Massey Ferguson that hadn't run in at least 6 years. Megan crossed her arms and looked at me like she already knew what I was thinking. "You're not actually considering this, are you?" she asked. I didn't answer right away because I was looking past the buildings toward the fields stretching across the property. 70 acres of land. 70 acres of possibility. Entry 5. May 15th. The auction lasted less than 5 minutes. The bank representative stood in the driveway reading the terms, waiting for bidders who never arrived. I placed the minimum offer of $26,000 and waited for someone else to raise it. No one did. Just like that, the old Grayson farm belonged to me. Megan stared at the paperwork in my hands like it might burst into flames. "You just bought a failing farm," she said. "You don't know anything about farming." She was absolutely right. At that moment, the closest I had ever come to farming was mowing my suburban lawn once a week. But strangely, that didn't scare me. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the divorce. Curiosity about what might happen next. Entry 6. May 21st. Moving in would be generous wording for what I actually did. The farmhouse only had one room where the ceiling hadn't collapsed, so I set up a mattress there and called it home. The well pump was broken, which meant hauling water from town in plastic containers. The electricity worked half the time thanks to wiring that looked older than I was. At night, the wind rattled loose boards on the barn, and the whole property groaned like it was remembering better days. Most people would have seen disaster. I saw problems waiting to be solved. Entry 7. May 30th. Megan started visiting on weekends, partly to help and partly to make sure I hadn't completely lost my mind. One Saturday, she brought her friend Lucas, who worked as a mechanic at a repair shop in town. After walking around the property for a while, Lucas stalked in the shed and looked at the tractor like a doctor examining a patient. "Mind if we try something?" he asked. For the next few hours, we drained old fuel that smelled like paint thinner, replaced spark plugs, cleaned the carburetor, and charged a battery that looked ancient. None of us expected much, but when Lucas finally turned the key, the engine coughed once, then twice, and suddenly exploded into a loud, rattling roar that echoed across the empty fields. A thick cloud of smoke poured out of the exhaust while birds scattered from the rafters. I stood there staring at that old tractor like it had just performed a miracle. Megan started laughing. Lucas just grinned and slapped the hood. "Well," he said, "looks like something on this farm still works." I ran my hand across the dusty metal and felt something shift inside me. A strange realization that maybe broken things weren't always finished. Sometimes they just needed someone willing to try fixing them. And standing there in that shed with a tractor that hadn't run in years suddenly rumbling back to life, I had the feeling that the farm and I might have something in common. 2 years after my divorce, I had somehow become the owner of a failing farm outside Cedar Ridge, a place everyone said was finished long before I arrived. But the old tractor running in my shed and the fields slowly coming back to life made me think otherwise. Entry 8. June 10th, 2023. The first neighbor to introduce himself was George Walker, a 72-year-old farmer whose land bordered mine to the east. He pulled up one morning in a dusty pickup truck and stood watching me struggle with the tractor for several minutes while I tried to attach a disc harrow the wrong way around. Finally, he laughed and called out, "You planning to farm? Or fight that machine all day?" I admitted the truth immediately. "I have no idea what I'm doing." George nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "Means you're willing to learn." From that day forward, he began stopping by almost daily, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with tools, always with advice. He taught me how to prepare the soil, how to drive the tractor in straight lines, how to watch the sky for weather changes, and most importantly, he convinced me to start simple. "First-year farmers plant hay," he told me. "It's forgiving." Entry 9. July 1st. So I planted 40 acres of timothy and clover across land that hadn't grown anything in years. The work nearly destroyed my body. Hours on the tractor under the hot summer sun left my shoulders aching and my hands blistered from tools I barely understood. But every evening when I looked across those fields, I felt something new growing there along with the crops. Confidence. Entry 10. July 20th. My savings were shrinking quickly though, and Megan started worrying that the farm might swallow the rest of my money. I needed some kind of income before harvest season arrived. Behind the farmhouse, I had planted a small vegetable garden, mostly tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, and squash. One afternoon, I built a simple wooden stand beside the road and painted a sign that read Harper Ridge Farm, fresh vegetables. The first day I sold produce, I made $37. It wasn't much, but it was the first money the land had produced. By the end of the month, more cars were stopping every week, curious locals asking questions about the farm and wishing me luck. Entry 11. August 8th. The hay harvest finally arrived. George brought his baler and helped me cut and gather the field. By sunset, we had stacked more than 300 bales inside the bar. George bought the first 100 himself at $6 each. When he handed me the check for $600, I sat in my truck outside the bank staring at the deposit slip, realizing something simple but powerful. The farm could actually work. Entry 12. October 2nd. As fall arrived, George suggested another way to survive winter. The woods behind the property were filled with dead trees. "Cut firewood," he said. "People always need it." I had never touched a chainsaw before, but by now learning new skills had become normal. George showed me how to use it safely, and for weeks I spent my days cutting and splitting logs until long stacks of firewood lined the driveway. Entry 13. December 10th. Winter customers began arriving as soon as the first snow fell. By Christmas, I had sold more than a dozen cords of wood, bringing in over $2,000. The farmhouse stayed warm with the same firewood I was selling. Some nights I sat by the stove listening to the wind move across the empty fields and thought about how strange life was. 2 years earlier, I had been a divorced man living out of motels with no direction at all. Now every day had a purpose: keep the farm alive. Entry 14. February 1st, 2024. When I added up the numbers from the first year, vegetables, hay, and firewood. The farm had earned almost $7,000. It wasn't enough to call success, but it proved something important. The failing farm nobody wanted had survived its first year with me. And if the farm could survive, maybe I could too. 2 years after my divorce, I was standing in the middle of a farm that once looked completely hopeless, watching fields grow where weeds had taken over, and realizing the place that was supposed to be my last desperate gamble had quietly become my new life. Entry 15. March 20th, 2024. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year, and for the first time since buying the farm, I felt ready instead of overwhelmed. The old Massey Ferguson tractor started on the first turn of the key. The barn stood strong after months of repairs, and the fields that once looked abandoned were ready to be planted again. George stopped by that morning and leaned against the fence watching me prepare the soil. "You know," he said, "most people would have sold this place after the first winter." I shrugged. Most people probably knew what they were doing before they bought a farm. He laughed and shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You stuck with it." Entry 16. June 12th, 2024. The second year was bigger. I planted 60 acres instead of 40. The vegetable garden doubled in size, and I added chickens behind the barn so I could sell fresh eggs at the roadside stand. Megan helped redesign the sign and organize the small business side of things, while George continued teaching me the things that can't be learned from books: patience, timing, and how to trust the land. Slowly, more customers began stopping every weekend. People from Cedar Ridge now recognized the place as Harper Ridge Farm, not the old Grayson property that had been falling apart for years. Entry 17. September 5th. The second harvest was better than anything I expected. More than 500 hay bales filled the barn. Vegetables sold out almost every week during the summer, and the eggs never lasted more than a few hours at the stand. When winter arrived again and I finished selling another round of firewood, I finally sat down and calculated the numbers. After all the expenses, repairs, feed, fuel, and equipment, the farm had actually made a small profit, just over $3,000. Not much by most standards, but to me it meant everything. Entry 18. December 30th, 2024. One evening George and I stood near the fence watching the sunset spread across the fields. The land that had once looked abandoned now stretched out green and healthy in every direction. "Funny thing about farms," George said quietly. "They come back if someone cares enough to work them." I looked across those 70 acres and realized the same thing was true for people. 2 years earlier, I had lost my marriage, my house, and the life I thought I would have forever. I came to this place thinking I was starting over from nothing. But somewhere between fixing a broken tractor, planting my first crops, and surviving my first winter, the farm had done something I didn't expect. It rebuilt me too. 2 years after my divorce, I went to a failing farm nobody wanted. And slowly, season by season, we brought each other back to life.